I can't say how deeply moved I am, how honoured and challenged by being invited to give a memorial lecture in honour of one of the most profound and sorely missed feminist thinkers and scholars of that great formative generation in which a feminist intellectual project was forged. As has been mentioned, I had the great privilege to have known Naomi Schor, if only briefly. In 1990, during a conference in New York on the canon, she came and proposed to me, still feeling very much a rookie scholar in her astounding presence, that I should guest edit an issue of the fabulous journal Differences on Feminism and the Visual. What did I know about the demanding process of crafting a work of a group of scholars who had first to be judiciously selected and formed them into a coherent project on feminism and the visual that could make a real contribution to this prestigious intellectual site of feminist cultural studies? I have to say it was only in terror that I said yes. And trouble in the archives was the painful product and result of that encounter. As a theorized feminist and queer interventions as rupture and reformulation in the visual rather than addition and supplement. And it was in that issue in 1992 that I realized when I went back that I first presented the radical feminist contribution to psychoanalysis by the then little-known Paris-based artist and psychoanalyst Bracha Ettinger, which you can see at the bottom if you just read Matrix and Metamorphosis, which was her first major paper in English. In doing so, I was daring to situate myself at the very moment of the emergence of Butlerian gender studies in the early 1990s, firmly in the camp of the continental European feminist theorists, whose focus was sexual difference and feminine subjectivity, both of which Naomi Schor defended and elaborated in her later writings. How ironic it was, therefore, when I realized that this afternoon's lecture is another instance of trouble in the archives, now painfully offered in mourning and commemoration. In preparation for this lecture, I revisited several books by Naomi Schor on my feminist shelves, some delightfully bearing Mira Schor's exquisitely intelligent paintings on their covers, notably the very Kleinian collection of essays titled Bad Objects. And curiously, this too was relevant to my recent reflections on the historiography of the feminist movement of the later 20th century, which I consider as producing for itself a bad memory, and also to my question this afternoon about the good and bad objects of research, about projection onto and identification with our topics, writers and artists, and the shock when our idealizations may be shattered. Rereading Naomi Schor was a joy, for I discovered the deep affinity I feel for her continental theoretical orientation, the admiration for her intellectual daring, the respect for her resistance to the foreclosure of le féminin, the feminine as a vital topic of inquiry, and the identification with her judicious but mournful sense that key theoretical tendencies in feminist thought and cultural analysis were even in the early 90s being sidelined by the all too enthusiastic embrace of a Butlerian or constructivist gender analysis. So this lecture is offered in homage to a towering figure in feminist and French literary studies, and also to her equally creative and profoundly important sister, the artist Mira Schor. And behind both sisters lie the histories of creativity, but also, as Howard Bloch has mentioned, deadly persecution, whose European Jewish context will forge the final link with my topic tonight, one of the most outstanding and compelling but unclassifiable artworks created in the period just before Auschwitz was finished by 1943, created by a Jewish German artist while herself a menaced stateless exile in France between 1941 and 42. The question is how to read this work. It's a vast composite of 784 gouache, that's to watercolor with body color, paintings on paper, collectively titled Leben, oder, Life or Theatre. It's a single artwork that comprises both 769 redacted paintings with 58 pages of painted text and an archive of rejected and supplementary works totaling 1,325 that form one package. The package was placed in hiding and delivered to the world after the artist's death in a form that was only rediscovered in the 1970s as a sequenced whole, shadowed by its own rejections and preserved preparatory studies. Now here comes the first confession. I don't know how to read it. I've tried to do it many times. I first encountered the archive in 1994, and since that date have failed to complete 2 manuscripts. I haven't been lazy because I've published 9 articles or book chapters on the subject, but I did always come to the conclusion that I didn't really know what I was seeing, despite feeling that everything I had studied and written up to the point of encounter with Charlotta Salomon's work seemed mere preparation for writing about it. All that elaboration of feminist, queer, Jewish studies and the visual arts, my focus on trauma and aesthetics, and notably on the inscription of cultural memory of the Holocaust, an engagement with French literary and film theory, with cultural studies that expanded the boundaries of distinct disciplines to engage in transdisciplinary readings with music, image, text, and above all, thought. But I failed. So I hope I am now on the point of completing the 3rd and probably the final manuscript that I will allow into the world, and my lecture will explain what has made this possible and how it has been made possible by an entire shattering of everything I thought before now. Now, the 3 frames that I've chosen for today's lecture include crime, confession, you've already had one of them, and the everyday. So, of course, we will have to turn to Henri Lefebvre, who declared that everyday life weighs heaviest on women. Some are bogged down by its peculiar cloying substance, while others escape into make-believe. They are the subject of everyday life and its victims. So I want to explore this combination of the burden of the everyday and its imaginative recasting as the theatre of living, but also significantly of dying. I shall do so by presenting a reading of the singular modernist artistic project that has, as Mira Schor has already mentioned, been predominantly interpreted as autobiographical, Charlotta Salomon's Leben, oder, Theater, which yields well to the thematics of the everyday and, of course, the opposite, the event. It deals with both the mundane and the exceptional. However, in the case of women artists and writers subjected to an autobiographical interpretation, the focus often occludes the burden and fails to recognize the fantasy. Now, the twin loci of the gendered everyday are, of course, the family and the home. Yet we know that events happen in such places. By virtue of their habitualness, however, such events, crimes, for instance, register just as the everyday. On occasion, singular artworks may disclose the sexual politics of eventuality in the everyday, but also related archives can offer a point of entry, notably through the family album. The family album entered into our cultural analysis through the work of Julia Hirsch and Joe Spence, crossed with Roland Barthes, who have all taught us to read the indexical traces of the everyday in the photographic family album. This is Julia Hirsch in 1980. Lumps of experience, rites of passage, grains of poignancy and promise, all of these turn us into artists sorting through life in search of shapes and events which our cameras will turn into symbols and allegories. The sleeping child, the fleshy mother, the tired father, the testy siblings can, in the quick eye of the camera, be transformed into images of innocence, protectiveness, enterprise, and sharing. Family photography is not only an accessory to our deepest longings and regrets, it's also a set of visual rules that shape our experience and memory. So let me take you first through what remains of the family album of Charlotta Salomon, by way of introducing the artist, and in order to distantiate us via the image from the historically unknowable person who is so often retrieved only as the autobiographical subject of her artwork. There being no other archive, no letters, no documents, no materials with which to fabricate the author on the usual level of a lifespan of creativity and its documentation. A little girl sits on a balcony holding a doll. There's a plant in a plant pot on the small table on which she rests her arm. Others surround her, forming a permeable frontier between the outdoor private space of the balcony and the space dangerously beyond. Sitting upright, the little girl with her bobbed hair stares very evenly at the photographer. The child is about 8 years old. The photograph dates from 1926. The apartment is in the Wielenstrasse, Charlottenburg, a fashionable part of Berlin. This places the scene politically in the mid-years of the Weimar Republic before economic disaster and the political madness in which it would perish. Is anything of the complexity of German society, politics, and economics visible here in this private domestic scene? Or is this the epitome of the everyday, a snatched interruption of a little girl's imaginative play that we already know both performs social gendering and replays the psychic fantasies with which it is underpinned. Her right hand overlays or holds the tiny hand of a doll. At whom is she looking? Was she told to look up? Was she playing with her doll and someone arrived and asked her to look at him or her? Or is it a posed photograph? And what kind of person is a child who looks at a camera like this? It was only after I began asking myself about this photograph that I found the complete object. It's a carte de visite size photograph with an added script which reads, I won't bother you with the German at the moment, hopefully the improvement in the medical sense of the term will continue. Thousands of greetings and kisses, your, in the familiar, dein Albert. So more than a record of childhood, the photograph is a message to be sent to the wife-mother absent from both child and Albert. She will receive a photographic token of the homely scene from which she is missing, but which the child in her play replicates and thus substitutes. Unfortunately, the hoped-for improvement, in the medical sense, was not sufficient. The mother died on the 24th of February 1926, and that knowledge adds deep poignancy to the stiff but powerful image of the child holding her doll, caressing its tiny, helpless hand. Another scene on the same balcony. The child is older, it is summer, now the family is two. The child smiles wryly as she perches on the arm of the same chair, her arm now cast around the stalwart but bereaved Albert, very German with his toothbrush moustache and his dueling scar. Motherless, the child will then be photographed on a chilly seaside holiday in the North Sea with a government known as Hase, the hare, a photograph probably taken by Albert, the father, sometime around 1928. Then a new woman, sorry, what's happened here? Sorry. We seem to have lost something, sorry. Then a new woman enters the world of father and child. There will be a stepmother, a singer of international repute, beautiful, gracious, gifted, and determined, religiously observant. Not this one, I'm sorry, there's a slide missing. Life will change, love will return, jealousy will arrive. The next surviving image is an identity photograph of a teenager or young woman, 20 perhaps. It's now 1938. We see the same even gaze, even if a smile plays around the lips. The photograph is necessary for identification. She is seeking a weekend pass to visit her grandparents in France. She must do so before the age of 21, at which date she would need a passport. Her government, disowning its Jewish citizens, is marking people for life and death on the basis of its new racialized looking and identification system. Blonde, blue-eyed, but bearing a Jewish surname, her travel pass will be inscribed with a large red J for Judah to make sure everybody understands such people's exile from citizenship and ultimately from humanity itself. Then in a garden, sorry, that's the lovely woman who should have been in there before. Anyway, then in a garden in the south of France, she got away from Berlin. The young woman stands or sits between elderly maternal grandparents who found refuge in a villa near Villefranche outside Nice with an American, Ottilia Moore, shown here beside the elderly couple on the upper right. The old woman fragile, the elderly man white-haired, bearded and dignified. A final image records this young woman's existence. It is properly taken by Ottilie Moore in 1939-40. She's sketching in the villa's gardens. She has become an artist making landscapes. Now she looks up from her sketching. She has become lonesome, withdrawn recluse, only at home with her artworks. No doubt Charlotta Salomon was photographed for her entry into the concentration camp of Gurs in June 1940. But most significantly, she was not photographed for entry into Auschwitz, whither she was sent from Drancy in Paris on the 7th of October 1943, and arriving there and being murdered on arrival on the 10th of October. Ironically, the only document in her lifetime to inscribe her under a married name as an artist, Zeichnerin, is the type list of persons on that transport from Drancy to Auschwitz, on which naming herself as a graphic artist was bargaining with her potential murderers for life. But we must remember that the artist who signed her work had remade her name already as CS, disguising both her gender and her Jewishness. And finally, if you walk today on the Wielenstrasse in Berlin, the street on which stood the apartment building on whose third balcony the photo of the child with her doll was taken, and if you look down, you will notice a Stolperstein, a stumbling block. This is a recent form of German remembrance of its murdered citizens, a paving stone covered in brass laid in the pavement. which reads, "Here lived Charlotta Salomon, born 1917, fled to France 1939, 1940 in Gurs camp, interned in Drancy and deported in 1943, murdered in Auschwitz." Do the arithmetic. Charlotta Salomon was 26 years old at her death. Now, the question I'm putting to you is, do these photographs tell the story of the everyday life of a Jewish German woman between 1917 and 1943? Could there be such an ordinary story? Or do these photographs capture momentarily something that structures the scenes for us as allegory and symbol of childhood, maternal loss, travel, and exile? Or can we read the traumatic maternal absence in this child's life in the gap between the first and second images? Maternal absence is only present in its indirect effects of the new stepmother. And the other event that troubles this archive is political, the institution of a totalitarian dictatorship in Germany with racial genocide as its core policy that led to forced migration, statelessness, and ultimately state-sanctioned murder of a 5-month pregnant woman aged 26. This is inscribed in the album by the geographical displacement to France and by its premature foreclosure. I suggest that this uneven photographic remains of one family's life cannot register the collision of the exceptional and the everyday. The bereaved little girl become an artist in exile who, having been incarcerated in and released from a French concentration camp, created a unique and unclassifiable modernist artwork to inscribe that collision, but with a specifically gendered structure. Now, as a means of introducing you to the artwork that involves still images, paintings, that form a sequenced and durational whole, I'm going to show you 7 minutes of a film bearing the Dutch title of Salomon's work, Leben, oder, or Life or Theatre. In part, this film, released in 2012, is my topic tonight, but it serves me equally to introduce you to the artist, the artwork, and also to the reception of that work, around whose now troubled archive my lecture will then weave its Schorian thoughts about close reading, detail, and the everyday. The film, Life or Theatre, is made by Dutch filmmaker Frans Wijs. Returning after more than 2 decades to the topic of a fiction film he'd made between 1975 and 1980 titled Charlotta, that had turned Charlotta Salomon's gouache paintings into a cinematic storyboard for a Bildungsroman film starring Derek Jacobi and Birgit Doll, promiscuously using all of her paintings, irrespective of their being redacted as part of Leben, oder, Theater or not, or being rejected. And he filmed her story, making Charlotta Salomon the central autobiographical character of a visual narrative, therefore erasing the artworking by the painter, effacing the work's modernism, ignoring its structuration, deflecting its enigmatic questioning of the dead, and denying its ultimately difficult purpose. In the film Wijs made in 2012, you will meet some of the key players in the introduction of the work of the hitherto unknown nameless artist into the cultural memory of the Holocaust and into art history after the date of 1961, when her work was first exhibited in the Stedelijk Museum in Amsterdam, curated by Ad Peterson. You will also see a virtual exhibition of the gouache paintings showing their scale and sequencing that form the opening act of this artist's memory. Now, this is going to display. Can we turn the lights out again? I'm going to do that.
In a basement where the belongings of Mrs. Ottilie Moore were stored, paintings by a young Jewish artist named Charlotta Salomon are found. Charlotta hid and painted in this region in the last years of her life during World War II. Charlotta's most significant work is an autobiographical dramatic play called Life or Theatre, recounting the annals of a family in Germany. She painted, wrote the text, and selected the music.
Het is geen echt dagboek, het is geen gewone autobiografie. Het Leven, oder, theater wisten wij tegen die tijd nog wel dat de titel was. Daar zit het ook echt tussenin. En ja, ik vond het dus echt een fascinerend ding.
Het is natuurlijk zo dat het werk wordt altijd helemaal tegen de ingepakt in de jodenvervolging. Terwijl het natuurlijk voor een heel groot deel een persoonlijke worsteling is om met zichzelf en haar familie in het reinen te komen of iets te begrijpen.
Ik wist niet wat ik zag en wat ik las. Ik was totaal overrompeld, alleen maar door het lezen van deze omschrijvende teksten en het zien van 1 of 2 beelden. En toen dacht ik, maar dit moet ik zien. Een van mijn eerste gedachten was, dit moet ik uitgeven.
Dat je meegevoerd wordt doordat het een soort film is, hè, een verhaal. En dan word je al gauw helemaal gefascineerd door al die betekenislagen. En de ironie spreekt mij ook geweldig aan. De ironie waarmee zij over zichzelf ook schrijft.
Man denkt ja manchmal, das ist ein Storyboard, den sie gezeichnet hat. Nein, aber vor allen Dingen die Aufrichtigkeit, mit der sie ihr Thema behandelt, das war von dem ersten Moment, als ich ihre Sachen gesehen habe, mir klar, dass das eine ganz ungewöhnliche Arbeit ist.
Toen ik in december 1972 het werk van Charlotta Salomon zag, was het liefde op het eerste gezicht. Wat voor mij zoveel betekent als dat ik al snel begin te denken hoe ik het kan verfilmen. Wat ik zag deed inderdaad denken aan een storyboard voor een film die ze zelf nooit heeft kunnen maken. Het duurde tot 1980 voordat het zover was. De film, na een scenario van Judith Herzberg, noemden we Charlotta. 5 jaar van research en voorbereiding gingen eraan vooraf, waarin we wekelijkse ontmoetingen hadden met Charlottes stiefmoeder, Salomon. Op een dag, tijdens het afscheid, gaf ze onze envelop mee met een aantal bladen ter lezing. De met verf en penseel geschilderde tekst bleek deel uit te maken van een brief die Charlotte 6 maanden na voltooiing van haar levenswerk had gericht aan haar grote liefde Amadeus Salomon. De bladen die wij meekregen hadden Paula en haar man uit het werk gehaald. Paula vond het belangrijk dat we de inhoud leerden kennen, maar vroeg ons die niet in de film te gebruiken.
Er komen dingen in voor die voor mij absoluut onverwachts toch nog zijn. In ieder geval heb ik wat bladen overgeschreven, zodat we dus de oorspronkelijke weer hier kunnen laten.
Dus met aan in het geschreven.
U hebt hem over hebben moeten bewaren in de kaart.
Die bladen, je hebt het zoiets daar weg, die weg, nee. Ich habe es geschrieben auch auf der Bank, aber soll ich es da nicht tun?
I knew there were pages missing because it ends in the middle of a sentence. But I didn't know if it was just one line or pages or what it was. No one in 12 years of working on this biography ever mentioned to me that there was any more.
Iets moest zurück en daar stond het. En dit is wat wij hebben overgetikt. Zum Leben, zu meiner Arbeit, zu meiner Glück. Dit is de hele brief, waarvan alleen de middelste bladen hier in het museum zijn bewaard gebleven. Ein Brief an Amadeus Salomon, 6 Monate nach der Vollendung der vorliegenden Blätter. Geliebter Freund, ich danke dir. Wie ich dich liebe, so hat noch nie ein Mensch einander geliebt.
I'm not going to tell you what the missing document reveals yet. As if you were reading a good detective novel, you're going to have to wait to discover the contents. So now we're going to move on to crime. Writing mischievously about one of the classic novels by the queen of British detective fiction, Agatha Christie, The Murder of Roger Ackroyd, French literary theorist Pierre Bayard argues that the murderer in the plot may not be the murderer produced by the written text. Is there anybody here who hasn't read that and plans to? Because I'm going to tell you who killed. Anyway, tough. Famously, Christie's device in this novel was to make her killer the narrator, challenging thereby the reader's trust in the narrative voice while using that feint to disguise the culprit until Hercule Poirot reveals all in his usual brilliant way. Bayard's deconstructionist reading of Christie's text reveals the devices that Christie typically used to disguise and distract the reader from the truth, while at the same time exhibiting the truth everywhere in what is actually written. Bayard reminds us of the rules of the game for writing detective fiction defined by the American writer S.S. Van Dyne, real name Willard Huntington Wright, two of which are critical. The truth must be hidden throughout the text, and while being hidden, it must be accessible to the reader, always in plain view. The famous purloined letter. Thus, detective fiction has to proliferate signs and possibilities while sustaining the belief there is in fact one final truth. Now, the dispersed complications should congeal into a single resolution, but the effect of writing under these conventions is that language runs away with itself. And what language as medium and content of any text sets in motion to perform the rules of showing and hiding at the same time, these cannot ultimately be contained by the fictive hope of a single truth. Bayard thus argues that the generative architecture of possibilities is necessary for the detective novel to function, quote, to overarch the whole text like a set of reserve hypotheses that are valid until the final resolution imposes one of them. The question then is to what extent this virtual multiplicity of meanings finally generates undecidability, therefore annulling the model of readability that Van Dyne proposes. From the moment in 1994 when I first began to study the compelling modernist artwork Leben, oder, Theater, I felt that I was not sure what I was seeing and not sure about knowing, and probably could never know, at what I was looking. The problem was that the range of analysis to which I could subject this archive left me uneasy. If it were accessible to so many feminist, modernist, Jewish, Holocaust before, after Auschwitz, psychoanalytical, Benjaminian, Proustian or Arendtian readings, which I have tried, wherein lies its singularity, its artwork, its project? I wanted to go beyond the fascinating and troubling and even elusive figure of Charlotta Salomon, whose short, tragic and burdened life under the shadow of the Holocaust has become the screen for so many of our cultural projections that feel safest bonding feminine vulnerability to the face of disaster or death. And I would say that that is exactly why Anna Frank became the first icon of the Holocaust. The belated revelation of the missing pages of a text appended to Life or Theatre by this new documentary film has of course set the cat amongst the pigeons for all of us Charlotta Salomon scholars. It moves us from the realm of politically situated, gendered Jewish autobiography into the more treacherous field of crime and confession. I now understand my incompetence as an effect of the multiplicity of meanings and the resulting undecidability resulting from the fact that this is a piece of detective fiction. And yet I shall argue that I don't believe that Weiss's revelations return us to the safety of knowing what it is about. So let me start again. What is Leben, oder, Theater, as opposed to who is Charlotta Salomon? I've told you it comprises 784 gouache paintings measuring 32 by 25. You've seen the scale. 210 of the paintings have a transparent overlay. So here is Leben, oder, Theater. You have an overlay like this attached with significant graphic forms painted on in various colors and indications of melodies to which they should be sung or heard. Later words are directly painted on the painted spaces, indicating intensities and volumes of speech. And the total paintings in the package of 1,325 were painted in under 1 year between the summer of 1941 and early 1942, when Ottilia Moore paid for the artist to live away from her grandfather, alone in a hotel on Saint-Jean-de-Cap-Ferrat. Some months, maybe even a year after completion, the rapidly painted works were revisited, resequenced, selected, and deselected, many by having eyes and mouths taped over. They were numbered in 2 different systems, and then even later introduced and concluded with 10 pages of text 2 of introduction, and 8 in conclusion. This group also included a somber memorial page quoting a psalm from the most serious day of Jewish religious festivals, Yom Kippur, and it's of the memorial service for the dead on Yom Kippur, the Day of Atonement. And that is balanced by this strangely Brechtian playbill for a 3-coloured musical play with ironically named characters such as Can and Bim Bam and Sing Sang and Kling Klang, and of course Amadeus Darbalone, which means penniless Mozart. In February 1943, it was packaged up with all the additional and all the rejected material, labelled protectively as the property of the American Ottilie Moore, and placed in hiding with a local French doctor. In 1947, it was given to the artist's surviving parents by Ottilie Moore, to whom it was dedicated, but because she did not want it. Elements were first exhibited in 1961 in Amsterdam's Modern Art Museum, alongside missing portraits and landscapes owned by Ottilie Moore, which then disappeared until 2005. The show was curated by Ad Peterson. A selection of the gouaches, and this is the book to which Mira referred, was published in 1963 without grasping which images were technically part of the actual work and which were rejected supplements. It was titled Charlotta, a Diary in Pictures, thus transforming a unique modernist artwork into a private and personal document, giving neither its title nor the author's full name. In 1972, the Jumble Paintings, deposited in 1971 in the Jewish Historical Museum as Holocaust testimony, as opposed to the Modern Art Museum in which they'd first been seen, they were finally resorted in an Amsterdam warehouse and the sequences rediscovered. This was then shown by the Jewish Historical Museum. In 1981, a facsimile of the paintings, but not the overlays, but with the transcribed text, appeared, published by Gary Schwartz, whom you saw, in a publication that also personalized and familiarized the work by titling the volume Charlotta and presenting it as an autobiographical play. Thus, by 1981, The Woman and a Life Story, but not her artwork, came to the fore, and the autobiographical reading has dominated, to be consolidated in 1994 by a biography published by Mary Felstener, titled simply To Paint Her Life, but placing that under the dread sign of her murderers, Charlotta Salomon, in the Nazi era. Now, I don't want to follow that line. I want to counter this trend by focusing on the text image object. And to help you, I have made a map of the work, so you can see something of the proportions of its theatrical, geopolitical, and narrative structure, with its massive emphasis in the main part on events during just 1 year, 1937 to 38. And you can see 467 of the paintings are focused on that one moment. There are acts and scenes within acts, but there are also some chapters, as if at some point it was also imagined as a book. The vast central section is framed by 2 wings, a prologue linking the acts that took place in events that took place in Berlin from 1913 to 1936, and an epilogue in France in 1939 to 40. Each element has a dominant color and a specific set of musical references or motifs. Act 1 of the prologue covered the lives of 4 women between 1880 and 1930. Act 2, at the bottom here, introduces the historical event of the 30th of January, not 31, not the 30th of March. It's the first time Hitler is given the position of Chancellor. And then the effects of this event on a teenage woman and her family circle, which sort of therefore has the politics here, and then the final thing, which is the pogrom of 1938, that breaks the sequence of the centre and drives the woman into the exile in France. The main part focuses on the encounter with Man and his teaching. And that man was a survivor of World War I and the trenches, who had been left for dead amidst the dead and dying. His trauma left him amnesiac and voiceless, and his recovery led him to a Nietzschean theory about the voice, learn to sing, "Oh my soul," he quotes frequently, and healing that links song and sex to the renewal of life after an encounter with death. He appears not only as a character, but as a source of philosophical ideas by the curious device of this talking head. He is also the source of the sexual initiation of the artist, and together with the beautiful singing stepmother, they represent life-creating and death-defying creativity through voice and sexual initiation, the body's joy. Now here is a musical map of Leben, oder, Theater as well, which serves to remind us that this work is deeply indebted to the sensuous and acoustic affectivity of recently created sound and colour cinema, a dimension I cannot explore here. But I'll show you, I want just to show you some images from that, and just to break from my voice, to have Kathleen Ferrier sing what the woman is actually singing in this painting. This song, which is no longer considered to be by Bach, but it's sung with the kind of incredibly heavy weight of early 20th century interpretations of Bach. And it is a song which basically says, if you are with me, it's a Christian stroll, I gladly will I go to my rest. But it is obviously, therefore, very much a piece of music about death. Now, I'm going to restart at the beginning to go over what you saw behind the vise in order to take my structural map and analyze the beginning and the ending of the work. The cycle begins in Berlin in 1913 with a suicide and ends with a painting showing an artist painting. The artist in the painting, however, is beginning what will be positioned as the first painting. Thus, the work concludes at its own beginning, rendering what precedes the final painting this painting's backstory. It explains why it exists. It is as if the entire work was painted to arrive at the inception of its memory work, to recreate an Orphic journey to meet the dead, to raise its Eurydices, whom it will once again make speak through artistic ventriloquism. The bookends of the work might seem mythic, night and day, the geopolitical still imperial Berlin and avant-garde Nazi-dominated France. This first binary might invite us to see the work as a journey from German darkness to the great luminous modernist sunshine, a Van Gogh-like cleansing light that has new dawns, but the politics of her work will satirize the introduction by referencing France's adoption of Pétainiste fascist rhetoric of the new salvation. But I'm not convinced by that interpretation. The two paintings belong together because they speak across the huge visual architecture of the work to each other. Beginning and ending, they are in fact reversed. The last is the beginning. The Berlin night scene is therefore not the beginning of the story, but a remembered scene conjured up from this moment in 1940, an invented memory projected to stage an unwitnessed event that must be given an image created not to begin a linear story, but to insert the crucial clue to the project's purpose. Drawn together, the twin paintings seed into the work and put on view what the work will tell without ever having to say it. In that sense, the final painting is also the clue. It is telling us that whatever is now the present becomes intelligible only if we know about the event in November 1913, when an 18-year-old girl, also called Charlotta, left her apartment in a Berlin city center and walked 8 kilometers to drown herself in the icy waters of the pleasure lake, the Schlachtensee. So let's go back. There are several crucial features of the last painting, which is the first painting, with its evident visual quotations of Copenhagen and even George Watts's Hope. It's also in conversation clearly with modernist French avant-garde from Cézanne to Dufy and Matisse, the latter two sitting out the war down the road in Nice. But there are strange things. Matisse's nymphs disport themselves nude. Salomon's painter is in a bathing costume, not quite designed by Suzanne Valadon, and she is painting. Secondly, the paper on which she holds before her and which she begins to paint is transparent. It's not a blank white page awaiting her marks and colour. Its edges merely frame the sea beside which the artist sits to paint. The scene of the painting is not the motif that will be painted, but something will appear like develop on a piece of photographic paper that will blot out the present. Thirdly, at the horizon, against a patch of paper left unmarked, the stroke of a brush diagonally laid over the washes that form the sky creates an uncanny effect. the suggestion of a face, eyes closed and in profile, rising out of the sea. Is this haunting of the scene with a face identified with water chance or intention? What is its effect once seen? And finally, and posed perhaps remarkably, there are 3 words written on the painting woman's bare back. Why should such words be blazoned on her skin, invisible to she who paints, but exposed to an imagined viewer? The cultural historian Michael Steinberg first suggested a link with Franz Kafka's short story, The Penal Colony. There, Kafka tells the spine-chilling tale of a machine that slowly carves into the skin of the back of a condemned prisoner the crime for which he has been condemned. The torture leads to both the prisoner's eventual death, but also, according to the machine's prime and enthusiastic operator, an ecstatic experience halfway into the 12-hour torture from which the prisoner ultimately dies of blood loss and pain. Whether or not Salomon was aware of Kafka's grim tale, the reference allows me to pose the question: is there a link between these words written on the body and a crime? Furthermore, painted rather than engraved, the 3 words meaning life or theatre appear on this woman's back without the 2 question marks that will punctuate these same words when written as a title, and also without the 3 question marks that will appear on the overlay, unique in this part of the work, that is placed over the final painting. Where the threesome have the effect of more than punctuation, they become emphatic explanation. Und dabei entstand das Leben oder Theater, which isn't just that's how it came about, boom, 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 but from this you must understand this work came. The emblazoning of words on the body of the painter, in contrast to the more typical insertion of words as speech around the figures or as sound links between individuals, or as ironic commentary from outside the painted world written on overlays that prevails throughout the rest of the work, must have significance. If this is the point of disclosure of the truth of the image muse text, we need, following Bayard, to reread its overall textuality for all the signs that apparently congeal here in a body inscribed with an opposition, turned away to paint the death of another woman in the past. Neither a story of events, nor an analysis of the everyday, nor an autobiography. I have to read the proliferating signs of the crime of which these paintings are the bookends and visible signs. So let's ask ourselves, why did these women kill themselves? The very first painting, titled 1913, is the unexplained scene of a young woman in terrible psychological distress, escaping at night and alone through an empty city to kill herself. Replications of the central figure intensify and visualize psychic pain and disintegration, leading to a lonely and watery self-destruction. This opening scene is not a chronological scene, but a beginning, or what in film terms is called a cold opening, an unexplained event that does not necessarily relate to the following narrative. It's a stage setting, a proposition, and it functions also like the murder that initiates the detective fiction. We know that narrative begins with the break in the everyday, the rupture from the ordinary and the habitual. It is the event. And the painting looks like a suicide, but is that what the work will produce as its sole or even true meaning? Act 2 focuses on the first subject of death, namely the first witness, the suicided woman's older sister, Francisca. War breaks out. She too can get away. She will become a nurse. At the front in 1915, she will work beside a less socially elevated young surgeon. He'll do. She marries him. 2 ceremonies, one civic, one religious. Using the device of the film frame slipping through the gate, the artist paints a scene of the marriage night. But the surgeon must return to the front. A different spatial organization comes into play here to produce a painting full of meaning which we need to deconstruct from its composite. The painting combines a number of different spaces on a single page. The composite image signifies a narrative by its multiple compartments. Starting on the upper right, we see a train packed with khaki-clad soldiers being seen off by their loved ones. Peering closely, you may see a tiny figure in blue bidding farewell to her soldier husband, while a wounded man is carried on a stretcher behind her. Turning to the upper left segment, just visible on the left here, we see this platform relayed under the overlapping scene of farewell as a ribbon of departure. The platform is emptied, the woman in blue becomes more noticeable, alone remaining with her handkerchief aloft as the train is represented in a streak of paint speeding away. The crossing of these vignettes produces the underpass through which the weeping woman in blue now approaches her parents. In the centre of this newly formed spatial zone, she stands in conversation with the elderly couple, both leaning back in stern remonstrance. The outcome of this exchange is represented by the diverging paths of the elderly people and the couple and the woman in blue, following the lines of the framing triangle of the platform scenes. Suddenly, the multiplying woman in blue slips across the border of the frame, and sliding down to fall out of the bottom frame, she redirects her movement along a different axis to approach a doorway in the hallway of an apartment block, where she raises her key to unlock her very own front door. Now, we need to see the relations between the scenes to understand the visual proposition that creates a narrative of farewell, departure, sadness, and return home alone. The transparent overlay with its musical notes and commentary that accompanied this image indicates another drama being played out at the centre: filial disobedience, a woman's claim for independence, a refusal to return to the parental home. Why? Thus, the lower frame signifies not only the opening of a door, but an assertion of freedom for a figure who emerges slowly over the page as its subjective centre, a person making a decision, a figure of action. The painting signifies decision, a decision not to live in the parental home. Then, in a non-architectural space, images of the woman in blue, and this is her home, we see the home to which she's gone, as if it were a doll's house opened up from above. And then, in a non-architectural space, we see the same woman in blue float against a floral background. The year is 1917. She plays the piano, she writes letters, she watches out of a window that punches a hole in the center of the page for a tiny returning figure. She is clearly pregnant. The husband returns, a baby is born, bringing intense joy and pride. Motherhood has meaning and daily purpose until the child enters school, complete with her Schultüte. Anybody who knows about Germany gives children a tube of sweets when they arrive. Here's a photograph of it still today. The bourgeois German family takes its holidays in the Bavarian Alps, donning +4s and dirndls like the Freud family pictured here on their holidays in the Dolomites. Trains frame the scene, going and returning. This is clearly a pre-Auschwitz, pre-Lanzmann painting. An intimate scene of mother and daughter introduces the troubling notion that the mother might die. The window is offered once again as a passage between two worlds, and then the tone darkens dramatically. The somber color and multiple registers across the page create a chaotic scene of psychological disintegration and a second attempted suicide. The whole is held together along the left-hand side by the haunted face and looming presence of the depressed woman, no longer finding joy in the activities of her life with her child. And she's found in the upper right-hand corner, staring again out of a window. A physician's visit tells her to buck up and get better, but she steals poison from her husband's medical bag. Now she is forced to return to the parental home to be watched over by them. A scene of the visit to the recovering mother and child gives us the context for the carte de visite photograph with which I opened the lecture. They are shown saying goodbye. The commentary is ironic about the chiding and infantilizing tone used to make the woman get better, but she is mortally depressed. The painting's point of view remains with the woman, who, left alone momentarily by a nurse's absence, rises from her bed, moves to a window now placed in the center of the image, the whole of which image then gapes. If you see down at the side there, you can see the whole image opens out, yawning to the outside, and a trailing foot in the lower bottom here is all that we see, the clue that the woman has jumped to her death. And as I'll show you, perhaps, the clue to a memory of another traumatic but witnessed death. The unplaceable viewer is made to witness not only the imagined event, but the astute visualization of the progressive self-alienation that precedes the action, almost slowed down into slow motion. Then there is another multi-scene panel. We see the anxious mother at the top visit her sick daughter, only to find the room empty and the window open. A telephone call to another apartment on the Wielandstrasse, informing the shocked husband. And finally, there is a focus for the first time on the subjectivity of the daughter. She comes into view, but alone, uncomforted as the locus of the deathly affect of this reported news. She's shown in her hospital-like bed, knees tucked up in a defensive posture, the whole scene bleached of colour. She has been told. She has turned to stone. But what has she been told? She's not been told the truth that 15 years later she will make herself paint, agitated stroke by agitating stroke, a body disarticulated by a fall, and a skull crushed and bleeding on the hard pavement. These brush strokes do not describe a street in Berlin, but the velocity of an imagined downward fall into a no place that the painter viewer now contemplates close up. The image is in fact covered, almost tenderly, with the words of the melody from Weber's Der Freischutz that have been the leitmotif of this woman so far. And the painting traces those words as the outline of the body caressing the bleeding head. The text, however, reads in pencil, Franziska died immediately, the apartment being on the 3rd floor. There's nothing more to be done about the tragedy. So whose voice is being replayed, speaking brusquely, without any space for compassion? Is this theatre, when faced with such a traumatic reality and grief that the painting voicelessly articulates with its own gestural intensities? If we put the two images of before and after together with the intermediate scene inserted between the leaping and the dying crushed on the pavement, we see more than narrative. A sequence of paintings using different modes of composition and spatialities produce a relating set of meanings for registering death and representing grief. We must remember the intense blue hole in the center of this painting. The child will understand this event childishly. So she remembers her mother's promise to return from heaven as an angel and give her a message. So she visits the tomb and waits anxiously at the window for a message that never comes. As an adult, the artist will create a remarkable series of paintings about grief, whose effects require new pathos formulae, that is, visual forms for registering psychic suffering. Husband, father Albert claws his head raw in his unbearable grief and is bathed in a red hue. He is presented as an Orpheus, and we are expected to hear Gluck's famous aria. The music swelling forms endow the anguish with an additional acoustic pathos formula. Imagine this being hummed as the painting is created, blood flow by blood flow. And then we have a scene where the child enters to observe adult grief, her father's head shockingly covered in blood, signs of distress excessive as a response to the woman dying from influenza, what she'd been told. The commentary is a later ironic, if not sarcastic, comment on the adult's deception of the vulnerable child, while the images themselves visually register the shocking impact of the child seeing an adult thus broken and wounded by the distraction of grief. The signs are also there of the deceit she, the painter, in 1941 is now denouncing. The child is told one thing but sees the signs of a secret she is not told, and she knows there is a secret because there are bloody signs. The dead woman's mother now comes into view, and her grief, her psychic disintegration, is represented by her physical collapse. She's seated on the floor, huddled in sorrow. And the text reads, Mrs. Knara does not cry, but her grief seems to penetrate the profoundest depths of the world, from the tipmost tips of her hair down to the farthest joints of her small feet. Her grief seems to spread through her body. It transcends her own suffering. It is the suffering of the world, the suffering of the fate that Frau Knara, née Bend, has been elected to bear. The opening words tip us towards empathy with the twice bereaved mother. To outlive a child is unbearable. To bury both who killed themselves must be beyond endurance. But the final lives introduce an ironic tone, as if the reality of her suffering is at risk of its own theatricalization. Frau Knara, née Bend, reminding us of the social snobbery that deflected this woman's sorrow from understanding why her two fine daughters could have taken their own lives. The deaths of these daughters will be represented again in scene 5. There seems to be a picture there. When they are retold from the subjective vision of the mother, from inside her memories, the elegant Frau Knauer is once again huddled and reduced, sitting on the bare floorboards like a ravaged woman painted by Käthe Kollwitz. This section will be bookended by another image, however rendered in Modigliani style, and the elongated style of grief shows her seated at a window, but it is clearly now in the south of France. It's clearly 1940. This is all memory work. The painting mode deployed by the artist for this hypertextual dive into the imagined memories of the old woman involve a brilliant use of contemporary photographic and cinematic rhetorics, the photograph and the close-up. The voice of these paintings is the grandmother's, with her own self-deceptions and repressions. She tells us that her daughter Franziska was haunted by the depressed face of her younger sister Charlotta. But then after the latter's suicide, she's haunted by her ghostly presence. Marriage and motherhood bring her intense experiences of passion, but then both child and husband turn away. And we have this exquisite imaging of the isolation of depressed solitude and social alienation of a woman who feels abandoned, but her face addresses someone, the painter, who makes the encounter happen again and again. These images take us close in and put before us the face of the woman whose broken body, whose effacement in brutal death has been so graphically shown to us in the preceding act. A different need, another investment in creating such images becomes apparent with this repeated use of the face. The sequence brings us face to face with the face of Francesca Can. Now, one of the most curious facts of this archive and the photographic archive that I began to show you earlier occurred to me when a museum, Yad Vashem in Jerusalem, prepared its viewers for an exhibition of Leben, oder, Theater by matching the characters to existing photographs. It became clear to me, as you can see, there is no surviving photograph of the woman whose features are so intently studied and so repeatedly evoked by this series of transposed memories. As if through the grandmother's seemingly photographic memory, imprinted with her daughter's faces of sorrow, the painter could summon up the absent face of the maternal other in order, as a painter, to trace its images into its own subjective lineaments, to give it space, to give it close up. This sequence then takes the woman fully dressed back to the window out of which she has so often stared. She is seen face on as she gazes into the nothingness she feels her life has become. The viewpoint is outside the window. The painter then borrows from cinema, shot, reverse shot, to switch our viewpoint and place the camera or gaze behind the woman looking out. We now share the sight of the blue void, the void that is coloristically continuous with her, the one that is buried in the scene of discovery. And then the third scene in this photographic sequence, not what we expect. The camera remains in that space. The third painting in the sequence shows us only the empty window. It signifies her death. She has jumped. It shows she is missing. Death does have an image. It is located, however, in the survivor, the bereaved. Showing us absence, not the broken body, we're made to feel disappearance. Furthermore, the painting stops time, for it waits at that moment. The work pauses. And then we notice that outside the window is not a Berlin street scene. We see a red-tiled roof. It is, I think, the roof outside her window. It's not this one, but this one, in the Hotel Belle-Aurore where the painting was being made. The grandmother's memories fade from view. The pause makes this painting, this detail of place, speak of another woman, inscribe another hesitation before an open window, this open window, posing another question of suicide, the artist's. So here, embedded in this second telling of the event that now requires its traumatic surcharge from repetition with difference, reframed by the theatre of another woman's memory, a single painting speaks its own, the work's key question, life or death. As a painting made meaningful by sequencing and repetition, it registers also, I suspect, the dangerous longing to be with the mother, to pass into her space, to share her relief. Thus it speaks of the invisible suffering of the abandoned child, now the stateless refugee, the menaced person who has been in a concentration camp. It also reveals, however, that mother and daughter might share a motive for suicide, because you must remember the mother was not a refugee, was not released from a concentration camp, was not a menaced Jewish exile from Nazi Germany. So why, surrounded by love and hope, did she, like her sister before her, jump from the window or drown in icy lakes to escape life? This is the question of what life or theatre will take to the epilogue, where the bereaved mother will herself take the same way out. This woman is an exile. She is a persecuted refugee. She goes to the bathroom and finds her husband's medical supplies, the sleeping drugs and poisons, like all Jewish refugees they've brought, just in case they can't bear it. She tries to poison herself like her daughter. She is found before it's too late, but deprived of morphine she craves to kill her pain by her husband, she tries to kill him. Why? Does she blame him? The granddaughter living with them is driven to her own limits, trying to reach the desperate woman. In rapid washes of colour, the page is covered, and only fragile blue lines attempt to hold the bodies in place. In ironic paintings, the granddaughter tries to sing Beethoven's setting of Schiller's Ode to Joy, the epitome of German Hochkultur that the Benders and the Grunwalds had assimilated to no avail. It is of no avail. Blue lines sketch the frame of the window, yellow the billowing curtains, red the outlines of a figure jumping. Only the red quilt and bed linen receive much painterly attention. Then comes a painting that narratively has the granddaughter at the window, having arrived too late, looking out, looking down. Is this also a moment of pause? Should I jump too? Then the scene that was really witnessed by Charlotta Salomon when she really found her grandmother's broken body and crushed head on the pavement below their Nice apartment. It is this reality that she borrowed to make herself paint the truth of what happened 15 years before when her mother had jumped. The chronological order of the events is 1926, then 1940, but the order of knowledge is 1940, then 1926. And if I group the trio, we find the repeat of the window, the knowing, and the dead that we saw in the representation of Francisca's lens. Now, I've left out one event that you need to know, which is in between all of this. We found, and I plotted them all together so you can begin to see something of how, if I ever had to exhibit Charlotta Salomon, I would try to read against the linearity to find these structural, this is almost like a Levi-Straussian analysis of the mythemes that align in vertical columns. Now, one event is the report by the grandfather of how the grandmother died. And this is what, as it were, becomes the hinge. Now, what I want to do for you now is to go back to the Weiss film, just to conclude, if you can bear this, because I want you to see the revelation that might be the evidence that Leben, oder, Theater, like Edgar Allan Poe, was hiding something in plain view. Now we have the confession. Oh. This is the problem we had. Okay.
The death certificate itself was simply about...
Sorry, I have to stop this because I was prepared for this. Every time you prepare this, it plays fine, but I'm going to have to play this to you differently because you need the words.
According to the death certificate, Ludwig Grunwald died in his home. He had first collapsed in the street. Some neighbors brought him to his home, where he died at 11 o'clock on 12 February 1943. The death certificate itself was simply about a man that no one knew or had any idea about. So he was called Ludwig Grunwald, but his last name was misspelled. He was listed as sans profession. This was a man who prided himself on his long medical career and how important he had always been, and that he was a widower, that his wife had already died, and that was the end.
Und jetzt kommt mein Geständnis, für das ich diese Zeilen schreibe. Ich war krank vor Verzweiflung. Als meine Großeltern Deutschland verließen, nahmen sie Gift, Morphium, Opium, Veronal mit, um sich gemeinsam das Leben zu nehmen, wenn ihr Geld zu Ende gegangen sei. Meine Großmutter dachte nicht an das Gift. Mein Großvater hatte sich gehütet, es zu brauchen, denn der Selbstmord widerstrebt, wie er sich ausdrückt, seinem Naturell. Ich wusste, wo es war. Während ich schreibe, wirkt es. Vielleicht ist er jetzt schon tot. Verzeih mir. Es war sehr viel Kraft dazu nötig. Und diese Kraft war die letzte, die mir blieb. Vom Sommer her, vom Leben und Theater. Als er, der Großvater, schon unter dem Rausch des Veronal-Omelettes sanft einschlief und ich ihn zeichnete, war es mir, als ob mir eine Stimme zuriefe. Das Theater ist tot. Vielleicht, Liebster, ist es wirklich so, dass mit diesem Krieg auch das Theater, das die Menschheit sich gegenseitig vorgespielt hat, zu Ende geht. Dass die gesamte Menschheit durch schwerstes Leid und Erleben geprüft, einem wahreren, lebendigeren Leben entgegengeht. Ich danke dir. Danach möchte ich sagen, Amen.
Die heb ik dus nooit gezien. In die tekst speelt dat toch mee dat ze nu dan echt desperaat is. Maar het leven wint dan nog. Maar die grootvader, de laatste getuige, een setje geven.
Er verkörpert das eben auch den Menschentypen, der nicht ehrlich zu sich selbst ist und auch nicht ehrliche Beziehungen zu anderen Menschen hat und was auch dazu führt, dass alle anderen auch Theater spielen mussten in der Familie. Und mit seinem Tod ist eben auch dieses Theaterspielen in der Familie zu Ende.
Ik kan me wel voorstellen dat als je heel erg wanhopig bent en als je denkt van ik hou het hier niet uit, dat het in die omstandigheden makkelijker is om te denken van als ik dat doe, is het niet alleen slecht.
I can't carry a sick man and survive. And so I have to do this for my sake, for Naga's sake. I think that's a very generous reading of it, and I think it's totally conceivable that she did that. But she's so vituperative, she's so vicious about who her grandfather is, that it still leaves open the sense that she just simply couldn't bear him anymore. She couldn't bear being with him anymore, that she had to survive emotionally, not just, survive the war.
Wat een vraag.
The magic is, can I get back to, no. I'm afraid I have to go through the whole lot to get back to this slide because this is such an old computer, so we'll just have to work with this one. What you've just heard, therefore, and seen being read by the experts we met at the beginning of the film appears to be a confession of murder committed by lacing an omelette with an overdose of barbiturates. The writer of the letter tells its recipients that she's watching the man die as she writes. Does this mean that we are to accept Charlotta Salomon killed her grandfather Ludwig Grunwald? We know that real Grunwald died at 11 a.m. after collapsing in the street. He did not fall asleep after a poisoned breakfast. But our experts in the Vice's film shock me more for the speed with which they accommodate the outrageous confession of cold-blooded murder as a fact and reality and immediately make the case for justifiable homicide. The Salomon experts do not appear to have a clue why she, the real Charlotta Salomon, they keep finding through the work, might have done such a thing, or even written that she, in character, might have wished to do it. The speakers whom we met in the opening sequence, full of their enthusiasm and admiration, now twist and turn as they try to make sense of the catastrophe that has been inflicted by this revelation on their idealized image of Charlotta Salomon, the victim. What can they make of a confession to murder by a figure who has been claimed, like Anna Frank, to represent both the vulnerability of the victim and human creativity defiant in the face of political cruelty? They assume that she has done the deed and that she who has done it is Charlotta Salomon. But who is speaking in this text? What is this text? Since the letter appended as part of an image artwork is addressed to a character, Amadeus Darbalone, in a Singspiel or musical play as which the artwork is framed, and it is written as a love letter 4 years after there's been any contact between the character and the signatory, even according to the chronology of the work, the signatory, now the writer, and using the personal pronoun for the first time in the entire work, might be understood as Charlotta Can, the character, not Charlotta Salomon, the person. The text confesses, and being appended to the work, it would have made the work Leben, oder, Theater the indictment and the explanation for the murder this postscript revealed, or which the writer desired to commit. In Archive Fever, Jacques Derrida sorry, I'm not going to move forward that way. In Archive Fever, Jacques Derrida, if you remember, examined the historian Yerushalmi's fanciful letter written to the ghost of Freud seeking confirmation of the truth of his and psychoanalysis Jewishness. And Yerushalmi focused on Freud's last great text, Moses and Monotheism, in which Freud made the outrageous but brilliant psychoanalytical claim that the Hebrew rabble, summoned to leave Egypt by the Egyptian dissident Moses, rose up and murdered him. In Numbers 14 we find, and the whole community threatened to stone him, Moses and Aaron, stone them with stones, when the glory of the Lord appeared. Yerushalmi stresses that they did not actually kill him, but Derrida makes two comments. On the non-psychoanalytical plane, even if murder did not occur, the truth is that there was an intention to kill, and in the biblical sense, it was only interrupted by the supernatural intervention of the glory of the Lord. Turning to a psychoanalytical logic, however, Derrida argues there is no difference between the intention to murder and a murder, for, quote, the unconscious does not know the difference between the virtual and the actual intention and action. And finally, Derrida remarks that the unconscious may have kept the memory and archive of the intention to kill, of the acting out of this desire to kill, even if there had been a repression, because repression also archives that of which it dissimulates or encrypts the archives. So I think we have a text that inscribes a desire to kill, rites of an acting out of the desire. Sorry. Can you work out, you know, which, that one, it'll go back to the one there? Oh, perfect. Sorry about that. Okay. The text archives or inscribes a desire to kill, rites of an acting out, records calmly watching the effects of some action that could kill. Therefore, for me, the writer stands psychoanalytically accused of murder. But if there were intention and even action, the work only obliquely archives this by appending this excluded alternative, so that we might ask questions: why would the writer wish to murder Theater, who is now identified with the grandfather? Now, none of the people seem to have any idea why she wanted to kill them. This is the phrase that is written before the section which you saw at the very end, why she was doing it. And she tells of the winter in which everything I did for my grandfather made me blush. I was sick. I was constantly beet red from mute rage and grief. Now, something has happened between the eye of the text and the grandfather that disgusted or revolted or shamed the eye sufficiently to finish it so she could work. And what was that? Well, I think it was sexual abuse. And this is, I'm going to remind you, if you've seen it, Michael Haneke's film The White Ribbon, which has a scene within it in which the doctor, having tired of lost his wife and tired of his wife, his lover, begins the process of sexually abusing his daughter. Weiss's film's disclosure of the missing pages confirms everything I've ever thought about this work, because the first paper I ever wrote on Charlotta Salomon picked out this painting as the point of entry. It's so remarkable from what I've shown you, so Gothic in its horror, so unlike the manner in which domestic life in Berlin had been represented, that I already sensed it was the key painting. It follows the death of the mother, the funeral, the grief paintings, and its overlay reads, when she has to walk along the wide, endless passage in her grandparents' home, she imagines something terrible, with skeleton's limbs that has something to do with her mother. Then she is filled with panic and begins to run. She then locks herself in the bathroom, the only room in the house with a lock. And sitting on the bath, she says, "So that's what they call life," the exclamation mark falling over the toilet chain. The overlay over the monster plays the musical reference along the arms and down the legs of the monster, as if hanging his giant red penis over the retreating figure of the little girl child. He is a cinematic monster with outstretched arms and giant grasping hands, reminiscent of the German expressionist cinema's monstrous Nosferatu. Thus painted in retrospect and seeded into the sequencing that distracts us with its narrative movement is a terrifying image of the domestic abuser, as experienced or thought or even sensed by an imagined child, with which the adult painter projectively identifies, now burdened with the knowledge gained by her own subjection to the same abuser's demands. And just to show you the final evidence of this, this is what happens when she is rounded up and sent to the concentration camp. And on the way back, she paints a painting with the now broken grandfather, in which the legend is this: better 10 nights like this than one alone with him. We have her painting, but we also have this very agitated painting, which shows the grandfather in his nightshirt saying, "I think you must be calm about this. There's nothing wrong with coming to bed with me. I'm always for what is natural," which of course we know is one of the great claims, while the woman below says, "Oh, get away with it. You know exactly what I must do." And then she is again trying to escape from this experience, as you can see in the top right hand, and desperately asking the landlady on one of the hotels they stay in on the way for another space. And then finally, she comes to a set of words here, which she says at the bottom: "A little love, a few laws, a young girl, a big bed. That's life, and those its joys after so much pain, so many dead. A little education, a few laws, and inside a vacuum. That's what's left. That's what the human being has become." So Charlotta Salomon makes space in her vast theatre of memory for a moment that it seems she too contemplated suicide. She asks the question of life and death, and she exposes to us finally now the reason that the first Charlotta killed herself to escape what was happening in the apartment haunted by the groping vampire. The second Charlotta decided not to kill herself, but to paint life through voicing and singing Darmalone's philosophy of joyous sex and death-defying creativity. But 6 months later, she writes through the device of the artistic work that gave her all of these insights, that once forced to live alone with the grandfather, who, like the doctor in Haneke's White Ribbon, used medical right to demand sexual services of his daughters and a granddaughter, decides to end his days from poisoning his breakfast. Und dabei entstand, and from this came life or theatre. Perhaps I can't resist either the collapse of artists into the persona in the end, or vice versa. So I go back to the self-portrait. This is the last thing, sorry. To the self-portrait, when the artist looked into the mirror in 1940, and there we meet the same extraordinary steeliness of the gaze we met in the soon-to-be motherless child in the photograph with which I started. A look that dares to judge the world. So who is this person onto whom we have projected our fantasies? Abuse of incest is just as much as genocide a crime against humanity, but statistically it's part of the everyday. Some lawyers argue that because it happens to so many women and children, it cannot be exceptional and cannot be counted as trauma. Specific dimensions of gendered life experiences fall out of the category of the event, and they fall below the social and cultural analysis of the everyday. Do we place them in the category of the normal or the secret, the trauma or the crime? Incest is what Holocaust survivor and analyst Dori Lau would call an event without a witness, a crime in privacy that does not provide its subject or victim with the reflective mirror of verifying witness to rape, to the silenced murdering of a self. What would be the writing of this event, which is also the terrible truth of the gendered everyday? I think perhaps Leben, oder, Theater might now reveal what that might look like.